welcome to Franc Talking, episode 11. I'm delighted to be joined by Lucas Bergman, who I worked with very closely at Cazoo for three glorious years. And Lucas is one of the finest brand directors that I ever worked with. He was very interested in the SEO landscape, the digital landscape, and we'd work hand in hand in terms of some of the brand campaigns and the impact that would have on organic performance.
Yeah.
So yeah, Lucas, thanks so much for joining us. I don't know if you want to give a quick through as well in terms of your background and the brands you've worked on.
Sure. Well, I'd firstly say really enjoy working with you, Andy. Definitely the best SEO person I've ever met and worked with. So it was a privilege. So yeah, hi, I've worked in marketing, client-side marketing for about 23 years, I think now, on fairly mass market consumer brands, but across a few different kind of sectors. So I worked in kind of food and drink brands for the first part of my career, on brands like Old El Paso and Green Giant, Heineken, Kronenbourg, Pepsi. It's great fun, all focused on the UK, but often kind of quite big global brands. And then I kind of made a bit of a pivot about 8-9 years ago into digital e-commerce businesses. So I was at MoneySuperMarket for a couple of years, 2 years at Aviva, and then left Aviva to join and launch Cazoo, which was a great experience. But, you know, I've had some great experiences working on some awesome brands with some awesome people.
So great stuff. What I'd love to kind of get your view on first off is to understand, like, from your kind of top level view, what goes into a brand strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what your starting point is. But if you're kind of starting for a bit of a blank sheet of paper, the really key thing is to get a very clear, objective view of the market you're operating in. And, you know, depending on how much resource or time you've got to do that, get a really good understanding of the market landscape, the consumer needs that exist within that. So in the kind of realms of what we looked at in terms of Cazoo, we had a really kind of deep dive into understanding consumer needs around buying cars from dealerships, and then get to a point where you can be really clear about the role that your brand or your business can play in terms of meeting certain consumer needs, ideally for a particular group of people, and then how are you going to communicate the benefits that you can bring to the market, how you're going to kind of engage with as many of those relevant people as possible, and ultimately a brand strategy is about changing attitudes and behaviors. So how do you change attitudes and behaviors of the right customers that are relevant for your brand, ultimately in order to drive revenue and sales? So the better you can understand the opportunity in the market and what you have to do to kind of convince customers to engage with you and think about you differently, the more that's going to result in driving sales for your business.
And how do you think it's changed since you started in working in brand? And are the fundamentals still the same, or has there been like an evolution towards kind of other metrics?
I think the fundamentals are still very much the same. I mean, I've just changed the sort of businesses I've worked in, and worked in different categories, and worked in some that are just much more digital, much more fast paced. So I've kind of had the kind of luck to really experience in lots of different places. But the fundamentals of really understanding your customer, understanding your market, understanding what's going to drive changes in attitudes and behavior, that kind of doesn't ultimately change. But clearly the tools and channels you use to engage with people has changed massively. The speed at which you can move and adapt and change and respond to market factors or competitive factors has changed enormously. The growth of e-commerce, certainly kind of 20 years since I've been working, is completely transformative. But also just in the cost of entry for a bunch of brands and in different categories has come right down. So you can set up a business and a brand, depending on what category it's in, and sell to a customer and build a business much more cost effectively and easily than you could in the past. So that means that there's, from a customer point of view, lots of amazing, interesting, fascinating brands to kind of engage with. For a kind of certainly incumbent big brand, it's super competitive out there. So you really have to be on your toes. You have to really, stay on top of the competitive landscape, what the trends are in terms of different technologies that are out there, different channels, different ways to engage with customers. It's so much more competitive and challenging to stand out, to really engage with customers and keep your brand and your product and your proposition relevant over time.
Byron Sharp has emphasized in terms of the importance of mental and physical availability. I mean, that's still so true in today's kind of fragmented landscape that we've got.
Yeah, 100%, definitely. But I think there's just different business models. So physical and mental availability on a brand like Pepsi that I used to work on, what that really means is, mental availability. Is it easy for customers to bring your brand to mind? And are you the first brand that they bring to mind when they're in market? So I'm thirsty. Oh, I want a Coke. Hopefully not a Coke. In my case, a Pepsi, right? So that is what mental availability is all about. And then physical availability for a physical product is it's in the store. I can see it. It's there. And I can physically buy it. Super easy and it's affordable. So in a FMCG kind of broadly category, the physical availability side of things probably hasn't changed all that much. It's about getting visibility in store, on shelf, off shelf, display. Those sort of things are still critically important. But mental availability, there's just so many different channels that you can drive that through. And again, there's so much noise out there and so much of a battle for attention. And it's just hugely fragmented. So that's changed a fair bit. And then there's just a lot of other businesses that don't really rely as much on physical retail to drive physical availability. So physical availability for an e-commerce business is a lot more around visibility and SEO, for example, or the visibility or the layout of how your product appears either on your own e-commerce channel, or if you're selling via someone else's e-commerce channel, how do you get your brand and your product to be more visible than others? So that kind of falls in the kind of realm of UX and things like that. So that whole area has evolved massively. And you've got things like COVID, where suddenly that became hugely important for a bunch of businesses that hadn't really got to grips with it before.
Do you think it's become harder for brands to achieve good brand salience in this world where there's so much choice, there's so many channels that's bombarding you with comms and content? And the reason I say it is the previous discussion I had was on sports marketing, and we were talking about front of shirt sponsors. And in the 90s, I remember Liverpool, or the 80s was Crown Paint, Man United had Sharp, and Arsenal JVC, for example, right? And then but I couldn't even tell you like what the recent kind of sponsors are for. It's not because my football's interest has waned. It's just that there's too many things that are going on that I have to remember. So do you think it's much harder in today's kind of world?
Well, I think there's a specific piece on front shirt sponsorship is I just think the things, people don't hold on to them for anything like as much, and it changes around a lot more. But I think that points to, and how that's broadly relevant to other areas, just so much more volatility. You just think about even some of the businesses and brands that have just folded and disappeared that you never thought would disappear, not the likes of Cazoo, bigger retail brands that you think have been around forever, just disappear. Exactly, something like that. So I think it's at the same time, if you're a kind of smaller business or brand starting out, it's never been cheaper or easier to get going. But what that also means, the kind of flip side to that is that actually it's you and a bunch of other people also trying to kind of chase for the same thing. So at that level, it's both harder and easier to really get going and driving salience. And I think the ones that win are the ones that are just really smart and creative about how they can create something really, really visibly different. I mean, everyone talks about things like liquid death or what have you, creating a product and a visual that's so distinctive and so, is going to stand out in its own right. But I think even from a consumer point of view, often I get the sense that when there is so much of an overwhelming amount of choice and such a battle for attention, it's actually potentially the kind of really big established brands that have been around forever and have an existing really high level of awareness and salience that are probably going to be easier for people to choose. So the likes of your Cokes and your McDonald's, they're actually all performing really well, partly because they're just very familiar. and you're not having to make a difficult choice around, a massive plethora of brands that you haven't really got a lot of familiarity with. If you kind of having to make an easy choice, you'll stick with ones that you know. So I think it's continually challenging, but actually I think one of the bigger established brands have probably got an inbuilt advantage.
Do you think though that like how maybe fickle the audience is nowadays, and the fact that like behavior where people don't have that loyalty? So an example being, I know with Nike, they cut back significantly in terms of brand building, shifted to performance, and they also then tried to cut out the kind of the Foot Lockers of this world, and it's kind of backfired on them. Like, so that just highlights the importance of brand, like given the heritage that Nike has, like the importance of brand in today's economy.
It does, and I think I read Shoe Dog a while ago, or had an audio book, and just understanding the history of where they kind of built up that loyalty and how they built up that brand, and how far they, how far that kind of recent change, why that didn't work, and how far that's moved them away from their core is super interesting, because I think they really built up that brand in the kind of whatever in the 70s by really kind of building relationships and kind of building communities, and with runner community in the West Coast and the States, how it built out. And the kind of the more they kind of the bigger they got, they worked into kind of much more different categories of sports and sports apparel, and they just become a massive brand. And they've managed to maintain, for most of that period of time, a really strong brand, an amazing range of products, but also crucially they're kind of connected to the right distribution channels, physical retail distribution channels. And I just think that shift into D2C that they really kind of probably just went a bit too far on, just took them a bit too far away from that, and just created space for a lot of other kind of interesting smaller brands to kind of occupy that space, and build a close relationship with these communities of really passionate sports people, whether they're runners or what have you. So brands like On, even things like kind of Brooks Brothers, those are the kind of products that if you go to a running shop, people working in those shops will recommend those. If you go to a running event, people aren't really wearing Nikes that much anymore. They're wearing a lot of other kind of smaller niche specialist brands that have really got that focus on that community, whether that's through physical stores, through routes to market, through the retailers, or through kind of marketing channels. They've just been able to kind of fill a little bit the vacuum that Nike left about kind of showing the kind of care and attention and love of building a brand for particular groups of communities of passionate sports people. But I think they're still a really strong band. So if they kind of get their mojo back, and they'll kind of win those customers back. But I just think they took their eye off the ball for a period of time, and I've seen the error of their ways, I think.
How have you found those discussions with C-suite individuals regarding maybe more in the chief financial officer or revenue officer, or even the CEO, where everything is based on the quarter and not looking at 3 years down the road of like a brand campaign? How do you manage kind of that kind of discussion, and any tips in terms of stuff that you've picked up over the years of trying to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, particularly if you're a listed business. So you have to report revenues and profits every quarter to the stock market. So that there's always that challenge, and you can't get away from it. But fundamentally, if you don't invest in the long-term things and your kind of most valuable assets, which includes your brands, also includes things like your factories or what have you, like if you don't invest for the long term, at some point that's going to create problems for you. I think for a CMO or a marketer, you need to be able to explain and articulate the value of investing in brand in genuine financial terms, which is not easy, but you can do it. And I think there's good examples of businesses and brands that have done that and taken that journey. Airbnb, for example, I haven't worked there, but I think they've gone through a journey where they've realized that they were too over reliant on performance marketing. Part that was driven by the pandemic and their business was on the verge of collapsing overnight. So they had to start from scratch, and they were kind of forced to make difficult decisions about investment and realised that actually what they thought was working wasn't, and that doesn't tend to happen that often. But still, they've kind of really got to grips with the challenge and really understood that investment in brand is valuable and actually fundamentally drives profit, and that's ultimately what it's all about. So the answer to that and the way you approach it will be different for every single business, but fundamentally you need to kind of really lean into the challenge of getting alignment on the need to invest in the long term of your brand, and you know, not to fully to the exclusion of investing in the short term. You need to do both. You need to strike the right balance. But if you do one excessively, even, you know, investing too much in brand, it could also be a problem. Typically people invest too much in the short term, whether that's performance marketing or in the context of FMCG, that might be in price promotions in retail stores, for example. Investing too much in short-term triggers that, yes, do return a kind of an uplift in revenue week to week, but that on its own, I think has been proven many times over now, is just going to cause you issues further down the track in terms of just plateauing sales and lost profits.
Yeah, you mentioned the Airbnb one because that was interesting. I remember their prospectus where they said that I think it was like 96% of their traffic is branded, and it kind of highlighted the shift in like user behavior as well. Because if you I assume that if you overlay like hotels in Barcelona versus Airbnb in Barcelona, you can see that trend shift in time as people are thinking this product's amazing, and you don't even need to then invest in the hotel kind of keywords from Google.
Yeah, look, we you know, if you've got a strong brand, people know your brand and they'll look for your brand and they'll put it into search. Do you then have to pay for that P1, P2 to get them through to your website? Probably not. And we had the same issue at Cazoo, right? We spent a lot on building a strong brand. We got to a point where we had really high awareness, and in the early days before we got to a kind of high level of awareness, we would pay for our own brand turn to make sure that if someone was looking for our brand, they'd find us, right, and they come to the website. But there comes a point where that's just money is just not driving any incrementality, and you're really just paying for signposting online for people that are going to come to your website anyway, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to invest in it. And ultimately we cut it and saved a huge amount of money. So but that only works if you've invested in building a strong brand in the first place, right? Yeah,
exactly.
But it also takes you, if you can get to that stage, it takes you away from having to compete with very similar kind of products and services in a Google auction, which is not really going to give you a competitive advantage when it comes to winning customers. So you do need to have a strong brand to be able to kind of attract customers to come looking for you online.
You mentioned incrementality earlier on. Maybe not the Cazoo example, but earlier in like your career, how would you have measured like the incrementality of sales based upon the brand campaign that you're running?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways of doing it. You can get to a point where you do kind of very detailed econometrics, and I've done that in kind of FMCG businesses, even on Pepsi, and for a long time. The downside of that is it tends to be something you can only ever do once a year. It's quite complex kind of math and science. You'll kind of bring in an external agency to do that for you, and can be really interesting and useful, but it's just really infrequent and quite an expensive way of doing it. Interestingly, it's less so much about just investing in brand, more about kind of understanding the mix of different levers to pull. Pretty much my very first job on El Paso, and this is kind of, you know, a little bit come full circle now, something that people do. We did geo-testing, so we would kind of divide the country up into one or two different zones, and we'd run a completely different media flighting for TV in one region, different kind of price promotions, and a few different other variables. And you'd have to look at fundamentally which of those two drives more revenue and sales. And until you completely do a kind of separate geo-test, you can't really get to the nuts and bolts of exactly how those different laydowns are working. And interestingly, now we did this something similar with YouTube. Cazoo, so really understanding the impact on brand equity and sales. We ran kind of for a good couple of months two completely separate YouTube campaigns on Cazoo to see the impact there in two different regions of the country. So really kind of running full-scale tests, A/B tests effectively, but on a kind of geographical level is a really good way to properly get under the skin of what really is going to drive a different outcome. But clearly those are quite big tests. They're quite big things to set up. You can't do that at the time, but that sort of thing is the stuff that really, for me, will give you some straight answers in a way that a bunch of other A/B tests will give you some KPIs and metrics, but it might not necessarily something that aligns directly back to sales. So it doesn't necessarily give you the kind of clear answer you're looking for.
If you had like one of your, like if you were at Pepsi, again, like in terms of like your like media plan, I know obviously the landscape has changed and TV's been dying for 20 years and it's still strong as ever, but I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of like if you were launching a kind of a new soft drink under the Pepsi brand, like what would a media plan look like?
It's interesting you mentioned Pepsi, because actually this is 10 years ago. I was working on Pepsi at the time, and you know, we did for a period of time invest quite heavily in TV, but then we got to a point where we realized that we could never compete with Coke. They would always spend more on TV than us, and they just kind of, from a challenger brand point of view, just trying to copy the same tactics and, you know, executions as your biggest competitor. You're never going to beat them. So actually, we cut 90% of our TV spend and put it all on YouTube, and that worked brilliantly for us because we actually did have quite a distinct, different target audience to Coke. We were much more kind of youth-centered brand, and even back then, that's really where the audience was living. Weren't really necessarily watching TV, and Coke was much more kind of family get-togethers as a kind of core user base. So I think I've always kind of, similar to what you said, kind of the kind of death of TV, yes, has always been overblown, but actually I do think that is getting to the stage where it's just fundamentally shifting quite a lot now, in a way that's kind of quite interesting, in that the people I think still are sitting in front of a big screen together watching content, but it's increasingly fragmented across Netflix and Amazon and the rest of it. And that genuinely is happening. It's not just you and me watching Netflix. It's kind of pretty broad based, certainly anyone the age of 60. Anyone really want to, you know, so that is changing massively. And I think what's quite exciting about that is that you can much more effectively target quite you know, small audiences. You don't have to have 5-10 million quid to buy a massive annual plan with ITV these days, I don't think, or it's getting that way. So I would, you know, if I was launching something new today, I'd really look at that whole world of connected TV. I think it's interesting. I think there's still plenty of challenges with it. It's very fragmented. It's quite hard to really understand how you kind of buy across a lot of different channels and really understand what's happening and avoid really high levels of high frequency in a way that you can avoid in linear TV. Getting a bit technical, but I think there's challenges with it. But I think there's a really interesting opportunity around being really kind of smart about how you target people in a really kind of targeted way. And build awareness and brand equity with quite a really specific tight audience. And in a sense, you've got brands like Monster that have done this, and even Red Bull. They've kind of really built up that kind of cohort of real passionate advocates for your brand. And you've got a product that kind of really meets their needs, but kind of really build out that. But then, you know, from a advertising and media point of view, I think there's just more and more tools and more sophisticated tools to be able to really kind of build that out and target quite a specific group of people in the way that you historically had to kind of buy really big, really broad, expensive audiences. I think it's changing.
Do you think that's a natural progression for your like role then as well? That obviously YouTube's been around since what, like 2004-5, right? Google bought 2006, I think it was. So like, was that a natural transition to go from TV, which obviously for like live sports, you'd still want to make sure that you're advertising there if there's obviously you meet the audience's kind of placement. So do you think that was just a natural transition to start to embrace YouTube?
Yeah, I think the stats. I think I saw this for the States, but I think it's also true for the UK. It's the biggest streamer in the world. So 10% of views are now through YouTube. So, and that's not just through phones and laptops, that's through TV screens. So it is the biggest already. So like, this is not something that's kind of waiting to become a mainstream offering. It's there already, right? If you're not embracing and looking at YouTube, you need to get on the bus. And yes, there are other streamers outside of that. I think it's still quite early days with Netflix. I'm not sure I think it's quite expensive actually. But also they're still kind of developing that offering in terms of the big streamers, and then I think the likes of Disney will follow behind them really. So those are building up. I just think you've got to find your audience, and you've got to find your audience where they are, and they're not just on linear TV. Certainly if they're kind of our age and younger, they're on all kinds of different channels, and you've just got to find a way to reach them. And that's challenging because it becomes really, really fragmented. And the way that you buy them, the way you measure them is quite difficult, but you've got to embrace it. Otherwise, you're going to be left behind. You've got to find audiences where they are rather than where they used to be.
So one key thing that I always get when I see like this great creative on LinkedIn and loads of people talking about it, and I go, I really like that. But the thing that I find like most interesting is the distribution of that creative, because I can appreciate it from an advertising perspective. I can appreciate it as a marketeer and whether I like it or not. But if it's done in a vacuum, which I'm sure it's not, but I find that more interesting. How many people have seen it? What medium have you used for this? Like how do brands kind of look to that distribution, and how does that get measured, whether it's digital out of home, like whether it's in terms of like it is digital and it's display, like how do you think brands manage that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's all kinds of stuff on LinkedIn where you see really interesting stuff, and actually you don't even know if it's a real ad. It looks like it's been
like the fake ads with Rishi Sunak running off he left the
stuff. Yeah, and then you've got all kinds of stuff popping up on social channels. Like, is that real or not? Or you've got stuff that's really just built to win awards, which is fine. But ultimately, what matters most is your customers and how many of your customers are seeing it. And look, there are ways to measure that, particularly if you're working with an external agency. You'll kind of work to work out a plan to make sure that you're driving as much reach as possible, certainly in kind of more brand broadcast advertising, and depending on the channel you're going with, there's different ways of measuring that, right? So the challenge always, and the kind of whoever cracks this is going to be a very wealthy person, is how do you kind of ball it into one simple way, one currency, particularly to kind of try and work out, with my overall budget, how do I work out which bit of it's working and how? And often that's quite difficult to juggle because they all work in slightly different ways. They all have slightly different measurements of things like reach or what have you. And then the other bit that's quite interesting that I've heard a lot about in the last couple of years is they also have different levels of attention. So even within something like YouTube, a difference between a skippable and non-skippable ad is people will give it more or less attention. Yes, the cost, but CPMs on a lot of social channels are quite low, but you can flick past an ad extremely easily. The level of attention is really, really poor. I was kind of often think about cinema is probably one of the best, right? Unless you turn up late, which I often do, you're in a kind of very immersive experience. You're not going to stand up and walk out and make a cup of tea, right? That's kind of really high levels of attention, but it's really, really expensive. So you're not only just thinking about distribution and reach and the costs involved with reaching a kind of different number of different customers. It's actually, to what extent is there a high level of attention, and it's going to stick in people's minds for when they are in market to buy your product. So it's tricky, it's difficult, but actually that's what I find fascinating about it, is it's constantly evolving, and it's kind of just getting your head around the complexity of it is what makes it really interesting, but it's not easy stuff.
With the performance and brand kind of side, where there's always like this maybe overblown clash of kind of ideologies and stuff, they both do different things, but they should work together, and you can have like campaigns that are there to build awareness, and then obviously somebody then takes an action like further down. That's a very simplified view of it, but how do you manage where performance teams don't have so much input into some of the brand like creatives. So an example I saw was the Tesco one again on LinkedIn. They got a
Yeah.
load of criticism, and then it was like a bit Marmite. People loved it or hated it, and then somebody mocked up what a performance like marketeer would have done. And it was like QR code on there. There was like an arrow going like, here's the next like store. Obviously, it's going over the top, but how do you manage that to keep it as this is the objective of this campaign?
Yeah, look, I think I've been lucky to work in businesses where there isn't that much of that tension. Clearly, there's always going to be bits, but I think where sometimes goes wrong for businesses, actually, it's more about the way that the teams are structured and incentivized, right? So if it's quite siloed and you've got a set of objectives and KPIs here within performance marketing, and that's completely at odds with a brand campaign over here, and those teams aren't talking to each other. Like worst case scenario, they don't even report into a kind of marketing level suite. One reports into finance, and one reports into. So I think a lot of the problem stems from teams aren't really kind of genuinely incentivized or set up to collaborate and talk and share learnings. And I think conversely, where I think worked really well at Cazoo is actually we were just talking all the time. It was digital teams and brand teams were kind of effectively one marketing team a lot of the time. And one of my and I think we kind of try to kind of define with, well, this is a performance campaign because it looks like this and it does X, Y, and Z. And actually, when we kind of build it out in something like YouTube, you can build it to be targeted for those kind of objectives. So, and then separately, here's a kind of brand campaign and it looks like this and the rest of it. And I think there are some principles within that yes are true, but often things just don't actually work like that in the real world, and customers don't sit there looking at, well, that's a brand ad and that's not. It's really very much a marketing kind of definition. And great example for us when we were testing out different ideas in YouTube and working really closely with the digital team, and we tested one that we thought was like, well, this is a brand bit of content, and we're really going to use it to drive reach and drive awareness and drive consideration, and very much centered on, actually, we used really good customer stories. We had videos of people who had great experience for Cazoo. It was quite emotional, the rest of it. And as against, here's a Mercedes for, a discounted price. And that was kind of maybe a more effective performance campaign. I don't know if that was really the message, or it was 7-day money back guarantee, a real kind of what you would internally think, well, this is, as the day is long, this is a performance campaign. Ran those both side by side as an A/B test, and actually the one that drove the most sales was the one that we classed as a brand campaign within a week or two. And so things just don't work in the way that you think they're going to work. And actually getting to that kind of insight, and having tested that would never happen if there was two completely separate teams working.
Like with the likes of like pre-testing tools like System One and things like that, that's something as you would have in your kind of arsenal, your toolkit to kind of use to make sure that it hits home.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another thing is that different campaigns are designed to do different things, and with broader kind of broadcast advertising, creative, something like System One is great because they have a specific metric that looks at what's this likely to do for short-term sales. I think they call it the spike metric, and then they've got a metric that kind of aligns to what would this do for long-term brand building. So they have a way of measuring both sides of it, and depending on what your objectives are, you might want to dial one up against the other. Ideally, you can do both. So yeah, there are ways to understand what's likely to work better for long-term versus short-term. But also, I think there's just lots of really good literature, especially in the UK, by the way. I don't think actually outside of the UK, people understand this anything like as much. Even from what I understand, the US is for some people would say aren't quite a kind of as far down the track as we are in the UK. But there's loads of really useful literature just understanding the principles of what are the things you have to get right to get a brand campaign to really be effective, and what are the things you need to get right to really get a performance marketing campaign to be really effective. What makes it a lot easier within performance marketing is you just can constantly test in a kind of short-term way, and you have data loops and the rest of it. So in that respect, that makes it easier just to get really good at it really quickly. It's really
Yeah.
difficult. The cost of getting it wrong within brand is huge. Effectively, the feedback loops you're talking about is, the purpose of a brand campaign is to build memories in people's minds, right? So how do you know that's working? And typically they can cost a shitload of money, and it takes a while to get them live. If it's a TV ad, certainly at that extreme, the kind of feedback loops are in kind of quarters, not in days and weeks. The costs are huge. So the kind of difficulty of trying to crack brand in the way that you do in performance marketing just doesn't work in the same way. So understanding the role of pre-testing, the role of focus groups and research before you put something live is really kind of critical. And actually, I think a lot of people don't really have that experience of doing that.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think that just kind of like with this breadth of channels that you have, the way you could like initiate testing, I don't know why people don't do it more, because there is criticism of it, like about the testing setup. And like I just feel like the more information you get to be confident in your decision with this campaign, I think that there can't be a bad thing. So
yeah, 100%. I mean, the number of tools available for people to do that, and at really low cost, is so much better than it used to be. I can tell you that much. Even things like System 1 compared to tools that existed beforehand, it's cheaper and easier and quicker than ever before to test these things, even if just testing it on YouTube or what have you. But it's just been, again, really clear on what is the purpose of this thing. Is this to build awareness? Is it to build consideration? Is it to build sales tomorrow? And as being as clear as possible, and making a decision between those two, right? Of course, everyone said, well, I want all of those things, and that's not really a great idea. Just being really clear and decisive on what you want to do with this campaign. What are you investing for? What are your KPIs going to be? And being as single-minded as you can about delivering against that objective, and building the creative and then the kind of the media plan, the rest of it, to make sure that it's delivering against that specific objective as much as possible. Yes, you might get broader benefits out the back of it, which is great, but if you're trying to kind of be too many to deliver too many this at the same time,
like the ad doing too much. Like I remember I saw it a couple of years ago. I don't remember at the time. I think it was around 2014, 15, and there was an ad with Robert Webb for the post office, and it was around Christmas, but there was literally so much going on with it. So it's like celebrity endorsement. He's coming out of a sofa. He runs across like this, and I think it's been quite well documented. Like that, just got it wrong. But that's always the risk, isn't it? Where you're just trying to do too much in terms of one creative.
Yeah, I think the thing that people really, marketers and businesses really need to remind themselves is customers are not looking for your brand, that they don't care. Fundamentally. And that, it sounds weird from someone who's kind of built a career in marketing. It's just like the starting point has to be people do not care about your brand. And in the example of that, if it's a TV ad, they'll be looking at that TV, or probably not looking at any of them, but they'll be confronted with that TV ad alongside a lot of other ones in different categories, different products, most of them absolutely terrible. And all they really want to do is get back to the program they'd started watching before. So in that context, you're lucky if they're going to remember one thing, and they're only going to do that to make it really interesting and entertaining, because that's really why they're watching TV, and whether it's radio or outdoor. So people are going to remember at best one thing. So don't give them 6 things. Don't give them 2 things. Give them one. And make sure that thing doesn't change that much for the next time you do an ad, and the next one and the next one. And that's a really difficult thing for businesses to kind of get their head around, because you're spending a lot of money on these things. You want to get the most amount of benefit from them as possible. The danger is logically that kind of gets to people deciding, well, therefore we need to kind of shoehorn as many things in this as possible, but it just fundamentally doesn't work. So the big challenge of getting to effective advertising is often managing internal stakeholders to get everyone happy and comfortable with the fact that you're only really going to be doing one thing in this ad, and that therefore means there's a bunch of stuff that you're not going to do, and that might include therefore rubbing up a bunch of internal stakeholders the wrong way because their thing is not going to be featured.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, you're investing that money because you want it to work. And if you put too much stuff in trying to kind of communicate too many messages, it just is less likely to work.
With storytelling, I think it's still so important, and I definitely we are going to chat as well about AI, because I'm very keen to get your thoughts in terms of creativity. But in terms of storytelling, I still feel that's crucial, and using like a theme throughout. And the one that springs to mind is like the Snickers, "You're not yourself when you're hungry," and that's been going for like nearly 2 decades, coming up to 2 decades, I'd say. Like, how important is that for brands to maintain that? And I also don't think it's like lack of imagination or lack of creativity that you think, well, we'll stick with the same kind of story, even if it obviously adapts over time. Like, how important is that for brands? And I guess maybe it depends in terms of where they are in their journey.
Yeah, look, I think it's really important, and Snickers is a great example, because not only they've landed on something that's really works. That's the critical thing that you need to get right first. Like, it's all very well telling the same story for 20 years, but if it's the wrong story in the first place, then that's not great. But what's great about Snickers is they a while ago landed on a really relevant insight that was completely relevant to the product, because it's kind of the sort of thing you eat when you're hungry compared to other chocolate bars, and really resonated with the audience because it's something they recognize, that they're kind of grouchy and hangry or what have you. And they kind of found a way to bring it to life in a way that works across different countries around the world. There's a Japanese version of that you kind of would never recognize anyone in there, but it kind of works for Japan. And there's an Australian version, an American version, what have you. And they've executed it across, even in paid search. I saw they've kind of done some smart executions of the same idea, just in that relevant space. So what's great about it is that it's a really kind of relevant idea that can be expanded across different territories, different media, different channels, and they can keep it fresh over a long period of time. So that's the gold standard. That's amazing. Why that's really important and great thing to aspire to, from a customer point of view, is, again, if you want to occupy a tiny little space in the brain of your customers, just make it really interesting and keep it consistent over a period of time. So when someone's spending, a fraction of a second walking into a shop to buy some chocolate, they see Snickers and they have a point of view on what that is, and then it's gone, right? So and Kit Kat's another great example. They've been really consistent about take a break, or what have you, have a break, have a Kit Kat. I think that's probably been going even longer than Snickers.
It has.
You need to be there in the mind of the customer in the fraction of a second when they're in a shop looking to buy your product. And if you've chopped and changed what you're doing and no one's really clear what you stand for, then they'll just pick something else. So that's why it's critically important. And then just purely from a financial point of view, then every pound that you invest behind that same idea is just going to be giving you, I think I read somewhere about the kind of compound creativity. Like, it's just more and more efficient over time, because you're just topping up people's memory structures of what they already know about you, rather than building something completely new every single time.
So true. Like, you talk about Kit Kat, because that's one of my favorite adverts. I think it was in the 90s, where it was a play of the 1966 World Cup final, and they've got England scoring the goal, and then the ref looking at the linesman, and the linesman's eating like a Kit Kat, and then like goes, it's a goal. I remember that.
Yeah, that's the beauty of getting to an idea that really works, right? That takes kind of, it's really hard to get to those, and not everyone would have an idea like that. But if you kind of strike gold and you kind of land an idea like that, just whatever you do, don't get rid of it. Carlsberg, probably the best lager in the world, another example. And if it's a really strong idea and exists in the right space, you can keep it relevant over time. Again, back to AI, really good. One of the best AI ads I've seen is Kit Kat, in that they've kind of, the pitch, I don't know how kind of broadly relevant it is. It's certainly one of those ones that's kind of resonated on LinkedIn, but it's the marketing department could just kind of take a break and just hand it over to AI, and inevitably they're quite shit ads, but the kind of what's great about the message is that it still ladders up to that same idea, just in an interesting way that's relevant to today, and responds to a kind of very relevant trend right now, but it's still very much ladders back to the product and that core idea.
So if we take 2 of the 4 Ps, we've got price and product. Like, how important is it for brand directors to be in the room working like on this, and how difficult have you found in the past to kind of influence that? So if you see like from your research that there's a superior product and they are meeting this customer need, and you're like, well, we could spend all of this on advertising, but it's not going to kind of move the needle here. How have you handled that?
Yeah, I think it varies massively on different kinds of products and different kinds of business types. So within FMCG, they, all the 4 Ps sit under the brand management team, under marketing. So working on Heineken or Pepsi, I would broadly be accountable for the brand that I was managing in my portfolio, whether it's Heineken or Pepsi or Tango, what have you. I would be in charge of the kind of brand positioning and the strategy, but also I would be working really closely with teams to design what our pricing should be for the year, what our promotion activity should be, where we want to drive distribution, what are we doing with the product. So that tends to be true with that FMCG, not so true outside for lots of different reasons, but that tends to be, that was kind of what I was brought up in marketing to kind of take that view. Outside of that, it's interesting because, I've worked in insurance. Pricing in insurance is very, very complex, and my price for car insurance for one provider will be different to you. So, should that sit within marketing? Not really, in a sense. Because it's very, very complex, very algorithmic, and it's very individual. However, messaging around price is really critical, and that should sit within, either sit within marketing, or marketing should have definitely a clear point of view on that. Should we charge extra for monthly payments was a kind of big debating point at Aviva, and actually that was very much marketing driving that discussion. So yes, fundamentally, the perception of whatever you do is driven by the price, and that's harder or easier to communicate depending on what kind of category you're in. The extent to which you're priced in the right way to drive revenue and profitable revenue is really critical. That's really become under massive focus in the last couple of years, when suddenly inflation's gone out of the blue to kind of double digit. The importance of being able to manage your price and whatever way you do that is critically important. And yes, marketing needs to have a seat on the table in those discussions, absolutely. And then from a product point of view, when you're working in a digital business, product tends to be the digital journey, the website. If it's service-led business, and financial services also to an extent within Cazoo, so product tends to be a department in its own right, but actually the way that that's structured and the way that the customer kind of experiences that product and how it should evolve over time. I think the marketing team should have a point of view on that, and certainly I did within Cazoo. I had a kind of really close relationship with the product team, because fundamentally the experience that customer has with the product and how it evolves to attract a different cohort of customers, and how it should be, evolved over time, and where the priorities lie, that is kind of links back to the right marketing strategy for the business. So whether it sits directly within marketing or not is kind of really depends on the business. But should marketing leaders and marketing as a function have a say and an influence on the price and the products? Yeah, 100%. Doesn't happen all the time, but it should.
We can't finish a discussion in marketing without mentioning AI, and I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of your experience in terms of what you've seen so far from marketing teams integrating AI, which I guess has kind of come from the explosion of ChatGPT It's obviously so much more advanced than that, but in terms of getting it in terms of on the radar of many marketeers, it kind of was Q4 2022. And I think there was a chart showing the amount of times CEOs mentioned AI on earnings calls just exploded after that. So what's been your experience in working with AI, and especially with in terms of brand strategy?
Yeah, well, so I mean, since I left Cazoo around that sort of time, and I've not been in just one kind of permanent role where I'm kind of in amongst the department, but I've kind of seen it broadly from the outside, and kind of, you know, kind of lots of discussions and webinars, what have you. But I think the kind of key thing for me is that, you know, clearly there's always kind of new technology coming out all the time, but this feels different, right? This feels just so much more fundamental. Like, you know, it's just mind-blowing what it can do, and it constantly evolves, and it's changing all the time, and it's just incredible, the technology and the power of it. But I think there's still any technology, any kind of new technological revolution, it does take time for people to really understand what it can do and how to use it. I think people are getting to the stage where they definitely understand, to an extent, what it can do, but also what the risks are around things like hallucination and kind of some of the things you can get with, and how often it doesn't fully work how you want it to. So it's not necessarily that straightforward. I think what I understand and what I hear is that the first use cases that people will focus on is, how can I do this thing that I did before but quicker and cheaper? And then there's I think lots of really good examples where that can happen, where you've got businesses that are creating huge volumes of content. Clearly, with some like Midjourney, to a lesser extent ChatGPT, you can do all of that a lot cheaper, a lot quicker, which is great. Where I think the kind of, you know, later on down the line is actually understanding how you can leverage AI, not just to do the same things quicker, but to kind of grow more effectively, to drive new revenue, to drive, you know, attract new customers. I think that's the next bit that people will have to try and get to grips with, and that's a bit more complex. And I think that just will take a bit of time just to really understand, to play with it effectively, and then test and learn different things. I think different kind of businesses and different kind of agencies will kind of crop up that come out with different products that marketers can use. But I think there's just this huge pressure to do a lot right now, where really quite a nascent technology still, and I think people will still have to work out actually really how's it adding value. And it depends on the level of, in a sense, technical sophistication of a business, to what extent they can embrace it right away. From what I understand, if you're a business that doesn't have really clean data and a very clear strategy around your data, you're really going to struggle to use it quickly. Depending on your culture or your business or the way that you're structured, you know, where does the adoption of AI sit? Who owns it? Is it an IT thing? Is it a marketing thing? It's probably much broader than that. So you know, I think it'll evolve. It'll continue to evolve quickly, and different businesses will adopt it at different speeds and in different ways. But certainly feels like something massive and exciting, quite scary for a lot of people, and particularly within marketing and some other functions. Yes, there's an excitement to kind of get excited around new toy, but, you know, genuinely people are worried about, is this going to mean my job disappears? So there's that kind of concern within teams as well. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's moving extremely quickly, but it's you know, for a lot of people, understandably, can, you know, the implications of it are quite scary.
No, it definitely, and I agree with you. It is in its infancy, and like, do you remember when the native apps came out, and you had like, is it Carling? It was like an app of a beer, and it was just like, people were like, oh, it's amazing. You're like, well, it's all right. Like, it doesn't really do much. So, like, there was a bit of that maybe about 18 months ago, but from the business I'm working with and how AI is being integrated and dedicated teams set up, but also I think it is the responsibility as well, because like, especially in SEO, you can mass produce content with no personality. There's no, you could say, or put training data in, like, but I still think there needs to be more for that. I think from the
The
marketing,
risk is around content and putting it on social is just, rather than people being thoughtful on, well, actually I can just do this much better, they're just like, I can just do 10 times as much shit and just populate the world. And I've heard the phrase the enshittification of content, I've heard a number of times. Is that the downside of that is people think just use it as used just to flood the world with
this is where the because I use it every day for editing, ideation. Like there's so many good use cases. Like I think as well, like translations are
incredible.
Again, the brands I've worked with, there is a native speaker that does the review, which you still need to have these checks. I still feel, but yeah, like I mean, for stock photography, the videos that you can produce, like it's insane in terms of.
Actually, what I found, I kind of boned up on how do you kind of do, you know, initial brand strategy thinking through ChatGPT, and as a one of my favorite terms about something like ChatGPT is infinite interns. Is if you want to just get to a point where you've got a really good understanding of something, or you've just worked out actually getting to grips with a new category, what the basic needs, who are the kind of basic types of consumers, you can get to like 80-90% really good view in about 10 minutes on ChatGPT. And yes, that's not something you're just immediately then going to turn into something you execute and launch into the world, but it can get you to a really good place very quickly to start building on in a way that take you a few weeks. Otherwise, or you'd have to do a load of commission-led research externally. That it's really useful just for kind of, you know, spitballing ideas with a kind of a partner who can kind of bounce ideas off. That sort of thing is just hugely useful. And exciting.
No, 100%, Lucas. Thank you so much for joining today. It was a great discussion. I'd love to have you back a couple of weeks, months. We can chat a bit more about like dedicated brand strategies, who does a good job, who doesn't so much, and still love to get your thoughts in terms of that kind of detail. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Me too. Cheers, Andy.